I'm Pam Fantola. I'm a pediatric clinical neuropsychologist, and I run the Rare Disease and Pediatrics program at Cogstate. I have a joint position between Cogstate and Yale University Child Study Center, where I'm an assistant professor and see patients with rare diseases and developmental disabilities, and have a research lab that focuses on clinical trials. So we're going to talk today about two recent regulatory draft guidelines that have come out. The first being draft guidelines related to natural history studies in rare disease. And the regulators have strongly supported this approach and encouraged pharmaceutical sponsors to employ this approach of doing natural history studies before initiating a clinical trial, because the natural history studies can provide significant and important information that will inform later trials. The natural history studies can clarify the natural course of a disease, particularly for some of the rare diseases and the ultra-rare diseases. As a field, we have a rough sense of how the disease progresses and of the natural course of the condition, but not always particularly exact. We don't always know rate of growth or rate of decline, if it's smooth, if it's stepwise. And doing a natural history study can provide this needed information. For some of these rare conditions or ultra-rare conditions, we have a sense of what children with these diseases present with at different ages, but not all the details. So what an 8-year-old versus a 10-year-old might look like. As a field, we may not have as much clarity as we need to inform a clinical trial. And this is particularly relevant in trials when there isn't necessarily a placebo condition where everyone's getting treatment, or in conditions that are extremely rare and are going to have particularly small sample sizes in the trials. Additionally, the natural history studies can provide information about the acceptability or feasibility of different outcome measures. Going into a trial with individuals that have a very rare disease, like an ultra-rare disease, for example, we may not know if they're able to complete different measures. So we may not know if they're going to be able to validly complete a particular cognitive assessment or not. So this is again where these natural history studies are very important in informing the outcomes and the methodologies that we're going to use in the future clinical trials. And lastly, they can inform sample size and power calculations, and they can also be used to test out potentially adapted or novel outcome measures that you may use in further clinical trials. So that sums up some of the points from the guidance related to natural history studies. Another recent guidance document that came out was about rare diseases and running clinical trials in rare diseases in general. And with this as well, there are several important considerations. One being the development, or more accurately saying that adaptation or tailoring of outcome measures to the indication itself. So this has become a very important point from the regulators, where they're encouraging sponsors to adapt outcome measures to a particular indication. And from a scientific perspective, this is also important and makes a lot of sense, because by adapting these measures, you can make them more likely to detect change. So you'll increase the likelihood that you'll detect a possible signal. So if you have a measure that's global, such as a CGI or even a visual analog scale, where you're asking the clinician or sometimes the caregiver or parent to make one global rating of change about the individual, that's very broad. And in rare disease, you may see changes that are relatively small but have a very big impact on the patient and or their families. And we want to have measures where we can detect these changes. So to do this, we want to increase the specificity of what we're asking. So in like a CGI, for example, we can anchor it with specific markers or specific outcomes that we're looking for. So if there's particular symptoms we would like to assess, we can include those in the CGI and instruct the clinicians to think about just these symptoms when they're making their CGI rating. So we don't want necessarily an overall impression. We want an overall impression as it relates to these particular symptoms that we're interested in for this trial. And that will increase the specificity of the measure. We'd also like to increase the sensitivity. Again, make it a measure such as the CGI more likely to detect change. One way of doing this is to adapt your CGI to include developmentally appropriate anchor points. So many individuals with rare diseases or ultra-rare diseases have cognitive impairments and very significant developmental delays. So we can anchor the CGI, as an example, to some of the specific behaviors and symptoms we'll see for someone of that level of intellectual functioning, or someone with that indication. And say, for example, with language, we may be looking for behaviors like making vocalizations, using consonants, responding to voice, responding to familiar words, responding to single-step instructions. So we would follow a developmental hierarchy in the behaviors that we're anchoring in the CGI, and by doing so, this would increase our granularity. It would increase our ability to detect potentially even small changes while using a well-accepted measure. So using an approach and a measure that's been well accepted by the regulators. CGI is extremely common. So we're not creating a novel outcome necessarily. We're just adapting an outcome and making it more relevant to a rare disease indication or an ultra-rare disease indication. Another component to think about in rare disease trials is how you assess cognition. Again, in many of these individuals, they have very significantly impaired cognitive abilities. So they're falling in the range of intellectual disability or significant developmental delay. So how we assess cognition is different than it is in typically developing individuals or controls. So we'll use measures that may be out of the chronological age range for an individual. So you might have a teenager who's functioning at the level of a 2 or 3-year-old. So we can't choose measures that are chronologically matched to that subject. We have to choose measures that are developmentally appropriate for that subject. And that creates some complexities as to how you configure your outcome measures and what you use as your outcome measures. Because we can't necessarily use standard scores, and even if there's a measure that crosses chronological age and we could use standard scores, we're hitting what's called the floor effect. The individuals are at the lowest level and not making big enough changes that we'll be able to detect them with a standard score. So we have to think of different kinds of outcome measures that these cognitive assessments yield. So we may think of developmental quotients or DQ, just as an example. But these are some of the complexities to think about when assessing cognition in individuals with rare or ultra-rare diseases. Also of note, for some indications, but not all, there's indication-specific measures available that in varying levels assess cognition. Sometimes it's based on caregiver reports, sometimes it's based on clinician observations, but that's another option to think about in assessing cognition in these individuals. Another point that the regulators put forth in their guidance document was the importance of stakeholder perspectives, so parent and caregiver perspectives. Also subject perspectives. It's a little bit less relevant at times in some of the rare diseases and ultra-rare diseases, given the functioning level of the patients themselves. We generally rely on their parents or caregivers, but not all the time. So in some indications, subjects absolutely can advocate for themselves. But considering this family perspective is very, very important. So in something that's definitely of interest and relevance to the regulators as well. So to do this, one way is asking caregivers to indicate their most pressing concerns in more of an open-ended way, so you can get their perspective and what's most important to that particular family. It does create some challenges for data analysis and how to interpret that data, but it's absolutely surmountable. There's ways to categorize this information and collect the data in a very usable way while still taking the perspective of these caregivers and family members in the context of the clinical trials. So overall, we just wanted to present some summary points from the recent guidance documents related to rare disease and how we think about supporting and advancing the field of clinical trials in rare disease.